Okay, moving on to the next team in the SEC that we will be going over today. This is going to be the team that I'm going to predict to finish second in the SEC this year, and that would be John Calipari and his Kentucky Wildcats. And it's crazy because this year, just like every other year, Kentucky is going to be losing a lot of talent early to the NBA. And I totally understand that. We could say this every year. Kentucky always brings in a lot of recruits that do have plans on going to the NBA. But Kentucky is just losing so many important players from their squad last year, right? E.J. Montgomery, Emmanuel Quickley, Nick Richards, Tyrese Maxey, Ashton Hagans, Nate Sestina, Johnny Juzang, Khalil Whitney. There are so many guys from this Kentucky team that played big-time roles last year that aren't going to be able to return this year because they're going pro or whatever, have other aspirations. And I feel like with this Kentucky team, it's going to be very reliant on their freshmen. And two freshmen that stand out right away are B.J. Boston and Terrence Clark, both top 10 recruits, both big-time players. Terrence Clark is more the athletic type. He's 6'7", from Brewster Academy. He could really dunk. He has elite athleticism. And then B.J. Boston is more of the scorer, and he's drawn some Brandon Ingram comparisons. I think it's a little bit accurate, but he's just shorter. I feel like he could be one of the better scoring guards in all of college basketball next season. And then John Calipari also brings in some transfers that I think could really make a big-time impact as well, including Olivier Sarr, the transfer from Wake Forest. And if you watched Wake Forest last year, I really liked watching Olivier Sarr and the impact he was able to make on the game. He averaged about 14 and 9 for the Demon Deacons last year, and I do feel like playing for a team like Kentucky, unlike Reed Travis, who was a little bit undersized for his position of power forward when he was coming into Kentucky, I do feel like Olivier Sarr is going to be a much better Wildcat than Reed was, and ultimately for this Kentucky team, it was so important that they got Olivier Sarr eligible, because without him, I like Isaiah Jackson, the 6'9" freshman from the Michigan area, but I'm not sure if this Kentucky team would have the ceiling that I think they have without Olivier Sarr. The other move that John Calipari made that I really liked was bringing in the grad transfer point guard Davion Mintz from Creighton. Now, Kentucky has a freshman in this year's recruiting class that I do think eventually, maybe by season's end, will be able to take over the starting point guard role, and that's Devin Askew, the 6'3" freshman. I was actually watching Kentucky's Pro Day on SEC Network a couple weeks ago, and watching that pro day, Askew was one of the main guys I was really impressed with because he was just hitting three after three after three. And I know it's open in a gym, but you have a point guard like that shooting, that's obviously going to be a good sign going forward. But going back to Davion Mintz, one of the main reasons why I like this move so much was because I think he is the perfect secondary ball handler for this Kentucky squad. If they play Clark and Boston together, both of those guys are super confident with the ball, and I feel like a guy like Davion Mintz isn't going to be the guy that gets offended if he's not getting enough shots. He could really distribute, and I do think with his defensive and experience ability as well, that Mintz will be a good player for this Kentucky squad. And then they also have some freshmen on the bench that I think may not really make that big of an impact this season, but John Calipari has really focused on bringing in some guys that he thinks could stay long-term, and by long-term in Kentucky terms, I mean like maybe 2 or 3 years, maybe till their junior year. But he brought in guys like Cameron Fletcher and Dante Allen and Lance Ware, all of those guys that I think, to be honest with you, aren't necessarily going to get immediate playing time this season, but I do think Coach Cal just expects them to get better and better and better, so hopefully by the time they're seniors, they'll be ready to really contribute for Kentucky. And this year's squad, besides the transfers, doesn't really have much of those guys, but I do think with the elite level freshmen Kentucky has coming into the program this year, it's going to be something that they'll be able to get by. And they do bring back one returning player that I wanted to talk about, and that's Keon Brooks, the 6'7" sophomore. He averaged 4.5 points per game, 3.2 rebounds per game last season. And I do think when you look at this Kentucky team, Keon Brooks is going to be one of the more important pieces, because last year I feel like there were many times when I was watching Kentucky and I just said to myself, wow, Keon Brooks just has no business being on the floor right now. You compare him to your Emmanuel Quickleys and your Ashton Hagans and your Nick Richards. No, he just didn't belong on the floor in many times last year. And mainly, that was early. And I do give John Calipari credit for Keon Brooks somehow is still here. And there were a lot of people that did predict him to go to the NBA or transfer, especially after what happened last year. You could kind of tell that he really wasn't in that featured role, and Coach Cal really never expected him to be in that. But look at a guy like Khalil Whitney. He decided to leave halfway through the season because he wasn't getting an opportunity. I do believe that Keon Brooks coming back to school ultimately is going to be a really good decision for him, because now he's going to be in a much more featured role, and I do think him playing along with Sarr, Clark, and Boston as that like fourth option, maybe a glue guy type role, I think that's going to be really good for a guy like Keon Brooks, who I think last year actually really adapted well to that kind of role for Kentucky, playing behind Quickly and Higgins and Nick Richards. And I think last year also, that's one of the big reasons why I think Kentucky was so successful, because each guy had a role and everyone was able to buy in. Emmanuel Quickly was so improved from the beginning of last season to the end. We all know he ended up winning SEC Player of the Year. And I feel like last year, Kentucky was a squad that, besides Emmanuel Quickly and Nick Richards, not a lot of players exceeded expectations, and they were still really good. And I feel like this year, the talent at the top, even though it's younger, the ceiling is much higher. And for me, that's why I think Kentucky could go really far. I know the Wildcat fans are a little upset that they haven't won a national championship since the Anthony Davis squad, and they've had so many talented teams during that span. But at the same time, I actually do think this year could be the year for Kentucky. Just the way this team is built, and watching them in the pro day on the SEC network a couple weeks ago, you could kind of just tell that when this team walks into the gym, it's going to be all business. And I'm curious to see if this Kentucky team, with the top-notch freshman talent that they have, and I know we could say that about many other Kentucky teams before, but at the same time, I do think this is the best freshman class Kentucky has brought in since the 2014 squad that went undefeated during the regular season. What I'm curious is, can this group of Kentucky Wildcats avoid that typical Kentucky losing streak that they have early in the non-conference? And I like John Calipari. I think he's one of the 5 to 6 best coaches in all of college basketball. He always has Kentucky ranked in the top 10, top 15 by season's end. And I just think Tennessee is barely going to smidge out past Kentucky to win the SEC just because of their experience. But I do think Kentucky, out of those two teams, has the better chance to win the national championship just because of their top-notch, high-ceiling talent. And I'm really looking forward to see what John Calipari and these guys are going to do this year, because there are so many different players that can make an impact. And I think by season's end, if everyone finds their role, then Kentucky will be a tough team to beat, especially because they're just built to win tournament games.